Have you ever created something incredible, only to have someone else take credit for it? Something you poured your heart and soul into, spent countless sleepless nights perfecting, only to be tossed aside when they thought they no longer needed you? That cold sensation in your stomach when you realize everything you've built might be taken away from you. That's where our story begins. And just wait until you hear how it ends. I remember exactly how his cologne filled the room that Tuesday morning, sharp and expensive, like his custom suits and the Mont Blanc pen he always made sure people noticed. The kind of scent that announces itself before the person wearing it even enters the room. "Emma, we need to talk," David said, not bothering to knock as he stepped into my office. Well, not really an office. More like the corner desk they'd grudgingly given me after our app hit 10,000 users. His voice had that particular tone executives practice in front of mirrors, when they're about to do something unpleasant, but want to convince themselves it's just good business. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other. I arrived at 7:15 a.m., early enough to enjoy the quiet before the office filled up, late enough that the overnight cleaning crew had finished. My coffee was still hot, my mind already racing with solutions. To the notification bug that had been reported by 3 users yesterday. ClaimFast, the insurance claims processing app I'd built from scratch, was rapidly becoming an industry standard, with over 85,000 active users and counting. I'd been there from the very beginning, literally from the blank screen of a new project in my code editor to a platform handling millions of dollars in claims every day. Blue Sky Insurance Solutions had hired me 2 years ago with a simple brief: make claims processing less painful. That was it. No detailed specifications, no existing code base to build on. Just a challenge and the promise of a bonus if it actually worked. Those first 6 months, I practically lived at the office. My apartment gathered dust while I gathered requirements, built prototypes, scrapped them, and started over. 3 times. My friends started joking that I'd ghosted them for a new relationship, and they weren't entirely wrong. I was in a relationship with this app, with the problem it was solving, with the vision of what it could become. David, the chief operating officer, barely acknowledged my existence back then. I was just another tech hire, another expense on the company's books. He'd walk past my desk without a glance, heading to meetings where decisions were made and credit was assigned. I didn't mind. I was too busy building something I believed in. By the time ClaimFast launched its beta version, things had changed. Suddenly, David remembered my name. Suddenly, he was bringing potential clients by my desk. "This is Emma, the technical lead for our revolutionary new platform." My technical lead, that made me laugh. There was no team yet. It was just me, my code, and occasionally the UI designer. They'd let me borrow from the marketing department. The beta was a success beyond anyone's expectations. Claims processing time dropped from an average of 12 days to just 36 hours. Customer satisfaction scores jumped. Insurance adjusters usually, resistant to new technology, actually emailed to say they love the interface. "It finally makes sense," one wrote. "For the first time in my career, the software feels like it was built by someone who understands what we actually do." That was the sweetest feedback I could have received, because I had done my homework, spent weeks shadowing claims adjusters, learning their pain points, understanding their workflow. While other developers might have focused on what looked impressive in a demo, I'd focused on what would actually make their daily lives easier. As success stories rolled in, the company culture shifted. ClaimFast wasn't just a project anymore. It was the future of Blue Sky. Investor presentations featured screenshots of my work. The company newsletter led with ClaimFast success stories. And David suddenly became very interested in his development team. The first red flag appeared during a client presentation 6 months after launch. I sat at the back of the room while David walked the potential client through ClaimFast's features. Our team developed this proprietary algorithm that predicts claim completion time based on historical data, he explained confidently, pointing to a feature I'd coded alone over 3 consecutive weekends. I'd named that algorithm after my grandmother, Catherine. Her organizational skills were legendary in our family, and the algorithm embodied her methodical approach to complex tasks. After the meeting, I casually mentioned to David that the algorithm had a name. "We call it Catherine," I said. He looked at me blankly. "We'll stick with proprietary algorithm for client presentations," he replied. "Sounds more professional." I should have recognized that moment for what it was, the beginning of my erasure from my own creation. But I was still naive enough to believe that the code spoke for itself, that my contribution was self-evident in every line and function of ClaimFast. The team grew as the app's success continued. First 1 additional developer, then 3, then an entire department. I was promoted to senior developer, but notably not to development manager or CTO. Those roles went to external hires with impressive resumes from well-known tech companies. Never mind that none of them understood ClaimFast's architecture the way I did. Never mind that they came to me after hours with questions about why certain design decisions had been made. "It's about having the right image for clients," HR explained when I asked why I'd been passed over. "You're incredibly valuable. On the technical side, Emma. That's where you shine." I accepted that explanation because I still believed in what we were building. ClaimFast was my baby, regardless of the title on my business card. And babies need their parents even when they don't acknowledge them. The second red flag appeared during the development of version 2.0. The new development manager, Jackson, called a meeting to discuss architectural improvements. "We need to move away from this custom framework and toward something more standard," he announced, displaying a slide that essentially proposed rebuilding ClaimFast from scratch using a trendy new framework none of our team had experience with. "The current architecture is highly optimized for claims processing," I pointed out. "We built it specifically to handle the complex routing and state management that off-the-shelf solutions struggle with." Jackson smiled with practiced patience. "Emma, I understand you're attached to the original code. That's natural. But we need to think about scalability and future development. Trust me on this. Trust me." The tech world's equivalent of nothing to see here. I didn't trust him, but I was outvoted. For the next 3 months, I watched as the team struggled to replicate functionalities that had worked flawlessly in my original design. Deadlines slipped. Features were descoped. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elegant, purpose-built solution I'd created was being replaced by a clumsy approximation that checked trendier boxes on technology evaluation forms. Throughout this painful process, I maintained meticulous documentation of my work. Every design decision, every architectural pattern, every clever solution to a thorny problem, all carefully logged in my personal development journal. Not the company wiki, not the official documentation, but my own private record. Something told me I might need it someday. I also kept something else private: the authentication microservice that validated user sessions across the platform. While the rest of ClaimFast's code was stored in the company's main repository, this critical service, which I'd built first before anything else, remained in a separate repository under my personal GitHub account. It wasn't secrecy. The company knew it existed. I'd just never been explicitly asked to migrate it to the main codebase, and nobody seemed concerned about it as long as it worked flawlessly, which it did. The service had a name in our technical documentation: Authcore. What nobody realized was that Authcore wasn't just a clever name, it was a legal entity. Authcore LLC, a single-member company I had established before joining Blue Sky. The service wasn't just built by me, It was licensed from my company to Blue Sky, under terms buried in the appendix of my employment contract. Terms that granted Blue Sky usage rights contingent upon my continued employment or explicit license renewal. I hadn't planned it as an insurance policy. It was simply a solution I'd already been working on before Blue Sky hired me, and rather than rebuilding it from scratch, we'd agreed I could license it to them. The legal department had approved it without much thought, just another routine. Software license and a stack of vendor agreements. Fast forward to that Tuesday morning. David's cologne, his practiced executive voice, the subtle shift in the atmosphere that told me something had changed. "Emma, you've been an important part of the Claim Fast journey," he began, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. Notice the past tense. Have been. Not are. The executive's favorite way of placing you firmly in the company's history rather than its future. "We're making some strategic changes to the development team structure," he continued. "As we prepare for the next phase of growth, we're bringing in leadership with enterprise-scale experience." My stomach tightened. I'd heard rumors about a potential acquisition, whispers of a larger insurance tech company interested in Claim Fast. But I'd assumed my role was secure, given my intimate knowledge of the system. "What does that mean for my position?" I asked directly. David's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be consolidating the development function under Visionary Tech Solutions. They're acquiring our technical assets and bringing their own team to manage ongoing development." Technical assets. That's what Claim Fast had become. That's what my thousands of hours of work had been reduced to, an asset on a balance sheet, being handed off to strangers who hadn't been there for a single moment of its creation. And the current development team? Some roles will transition to VTS. Others will have the opportunity to explore different positions within Blue Sky. He slid a folder across my desk. "In your case, we're offering a separation package. 4 weeks severance, health coverage through the end of the month, and a non-disclosure agreement covering all proprietary technologies you've worked on." The words hung in the air between us. Separation package? A corporate euphemism for, "You're fired." Not laid off, not made redundant. Those at least carry the implication of economic necessity. No, this was strategic. A choice. I stared at the folder without opening it. "When?" "Effective immediately. HR will assist with the transition this morning." Not 2 weeks' notice. Not even a chance to document critical information for whoever would inherit my work. Immediate. As if my presence had suddenly become toxic to the very thing I had created. "I see," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. "And Claim Fast?" David stood, already mentally moving on to his next meeting. "The platform will continue, of course. It's a valuable part of our offering to VTS. They're particularly interested in the architecture. Quite innovative," their technical team said. Of course they did. Because it was. Because I had built it that way, solving problems no off-the-shelf solution could handle. Crafting custom solutions for unique challenges. "Well," I said, rising to meet his eye level, "I wish them luck with the transition." David nodded, relieved I wasn't making a scene. "HR will be by shortly to help with your personal items." He hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, Emma, your contribution to getting Claim Fast off the ground was significant. I hope you know that." Getting it off the ground. As if I'd merely helped with the launch, not architected and built every foundational element. Not spent holidays debugging critical issues while he posted vacation photos from Bali. After he left, I sat motionless, staring at my computer screen where a half-finished bug fix still waited in my development environment. 2 years of my life. My best work, my most innovative solutions, all being handed off to strangers who would likely never understand the care that had gone into each line of code. HR arrived within 15 minutes. Rebecca from People Operations looking uncomfortable but determined. "I'm so sorry about this, Emma," she said. placing a cardboard box on my desk. "I've always thought your work was amazing." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without my voice breaking. I began placing my personal items in the box: family photos, the rubber duck debugging toy my sister had given me as a joke, the collection of stress balls I'd accumulated from various tech conferences, all while Rebecca awkwardly supervised the process, clearly hating every moment but following protocol. "Your company accounts will be deactivated by end of day," she explained, reading from what was clearly a scripted checklist. "Please return your laptop and badge before leaving." I closed my development environment without saving the changes. What did it matter now? The bug would become someone else's problem, someone who hadn't lovingly built the system it existed within. As I packed, a thought began to form in the back of my mind. Authcore, the authentication service, my authentication service. Licensed, not owned outright. The digital heartbeat of ClaimFast, validating every transaction, every user session, every API call. I said nothing as I handed over my laptop and badge. Nothing as I carried my box of belongings through the open office where former colleagues avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their monitors. Nothing as the security guard awkwardly escorted me to the lobby, apologizing with his eyes, though not with his words. The spring air hit my face as I exited the building, a shocking contrast to the climate-controlled environment I'd spent so many hours in. It was 10:27 a.m., not even lunchtime, and my professional life had been upended. Completely. I walked 3 blocks before finding an empty bench in a small public garden. Setting my box beside me, I pulled out my personal phone and opened my password manager. There it was, credentials for the Authcore repository and management console. I hadn't accessed it from my personal device in months. There had been no need. The service ran flawlessly, requiring minimal maintenance. I logged in, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The dashboard showed what I already knew. ClaimFast depended entirely on Authcore for its security model. Every login, every session validation, every permission check flowed through this service. Without it, the entire platform would essentially be a collection of disconnected interfaces, unable to authenticate users or process secure transactions. The licensing terms were clear, embedded in the service's configuration. Licensed to Blue Sky Insurance Solutions for use with ClaimFast application, contingent upon employment of licensee, Emma Chen, or explicit renewal agreement. Standard. Legal language that no one ever expects to matter, until suddenly it does. I didn't make any changes, didn't revoke any keys, didn't inject any time bombs into the system. I simply waited. Because I knew something that David, Jackson, and the entire acquisition team at Visionary Tech Solutions didn't know. Authcore performed a license validation check every 30 days. The next check would happen in exactly 17 days. When it did, it would find the licensing terms violated. And then, following its programmed protocol, it would gracefully, very gracefully, because I was a thorough developer, stop authenticating users. No dramatic crash, no data loss, just a system that would no longer allow anyone to log in. A perfectly functional car without an ignition key. I closed the management console and put my phone away. For the first time since David had walked into my office that morning, I felt something other than shock and betrayal. I felt a strange calm. Whatever happened next would be determined by how long it took them to realize what they'd overlooked, and how they chose to address it. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. I applied for jobs half-heartedly, went through the motions of updating my resume, reconnected with industry contacts, all while watching the calendar, counting down days until the authentication service would perform its routine license check. On day 15, my phone rang, a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. "Emma, this is Jackson from Blue Sky. There seemed to be some authentication issues with the ClaimFast platform that we're struggling to diagnose. If you could call me back to consult We'd compensate you for your time, of course. I didn't call back. 2 days later, multiple calls from multiple blocked numbers, more urgent voicemails, emails to my personal account with increasingly desperate subject lines. Urgent. Claim fast technical consultation request. Critical system issue. Need your expertise. Authorization service failure. Emergency response. Required. I forwarded them all to a special folder but didn't respond. Let them connect the dots themselves. On day 18, 1 day after the scheduled license check, an email arrived from a name I hadn't expected. Melissa Winters, CEO of Blue Sky Insurance Solutions. Emma, I understand there's been a situation with your departure that wasn't handled optimally. I'd appreciate a conversation to discuss how we might resolve the current technical challenges with ClaimFast. My direct line is below. Please call at your convenience. This was new. In 2 years at Blue Sky, I'd met Melissa exactly twice. Once at the company holiday party, once during a board presentation on ClaimFast's success. For her to reach out directly meant the situation had escalated beyond IT issues to business continuity problems. I waited until the following morning, then called the number. Emma, Melissa answered immediately. Thank you for calling back. I appreciate it more than you know. Happy to help, I said neutrally. I understand there are some technical challenges? A diplomatic understatement. From what I could gather through former colleagues who'd texted me, ClaimFast had been completely inaccessible for over 24 hours. Thousands of insurance claims were in limbo. The help desk was overwhelmed. The development team was working around the clock trying to understand what had happened to the authentication system. Yes, Melissa said carefully. The platform is experiencing authentication failures across all user levels. The technical team has been unable to resolve it, and they've identified that the issue relates to a service called AuthCore. I understand you're quite familiar with it. I built it, I confirmed. It handles all user authentication and session management for ClaimFast. A pause. The team says they don't have full access to modify or troubleshoot it. Something about a licensing issue? And there it was. They'd finally found the terms embedded in the service configuration, probably after days of desperate troubleshooting, trace debugging, and code review. AuthCore is licensed to Blue Sky through my LLC, I explained calmly. The license terms are tied to my employment status. When that changed, the license validation failed on its next scheduled check. Another, longer pause. I could almost hear her mental calculation, weighing legal options against business realities, considering how many thousands of dollars were being lost every hour the platform remained down. I see, she finally said. I wasn't aware of this arrangement. It's documented in my employment contract, Appendix C, if I recall correctly. The legal team approved it when I was hired. I'm sure they did. Her tone hardened slightly. What would it take to resolve this situation, Emma? This was the moment. I could name an exorbitant price, demand my job back with a promotion, insist on public recognition, all the revenge fantasies that had crossed my mind during sleepless nights since my termination. But revenge wasn't what I wanted. Respect was. 3 things, I said. First, a proper licensing agreement for AuthCore, with fair market compensation. Second, my name restored to the ClaimFast documentation as primary architect and developer. And third, a consultation role during the transition to Visionary Tech Solutions, paid at standard consulting rates. Melissa didn't hesitate. Done. I'll have legal draft the agreements today. How quickly can you restore service? As soon as I receive the signed licensing agreement, I can update the validation process. The system should restore immediately. Another pause. You know, David never mentioned that a critical component of our main product was licensed rather than owned outright. That seems like an oversight that should have been addressed before making personnel changes. I said nothing. The understatement was almost comical. "I'd like to meet with you later this week," Melissa continued. "Not just about the current situation, but about your experience at Blue Sky more generally. It seems there are some perspectives I haven't been hearing." By that evening, I had a signed licensing agreement in my inbox, along with a consulting contract at a rate 3 times my former salary. Within 15 minutes of receiving them, I had updated the authcore validation service, and ClaimFast began functioning normally again. The text messages from former colleagues started almost immediately. "OMG, what did you do? Everything just started working again." Jackson's face when the system came back online. "Wish you could have seen it." "David is in serious hot water with Melissa. Emergency executive session all afternoon." I didn't respond to any of them. This wasn't about drama or office politics. It was about attribution and respect, recognizing that behind every piece of technology is a human who created it, who deserves acknowledgement for their work. The meeting with Melissa 3 days later was brief but enlightening. She had reviewed the entire history of ClaimFast's development and was, to put it mildly, displeased with how contributions had been minimized and credit misattributed. "The acquisition by Visionary is still proceeding," she told me, "but with modified terms. You'll be named as the primary architect in all documentation and marketing materials. The consulting agreement gives you oversight of the technical transition, and authcore remains your intellectual property, licensed under clear terms that everyone understands." David, I learned, had been reassigned to a special projects role with no direct reports. Jackson had resigned rather than work under the new arrangement with VTS, where technical decisions would require broader consensus rather than executive mandate. The following weeks brought a strange new reality. I returned to the Blue Sky offices not as an employee, but as a consultant with significantly more authority than I'd ever had while employed there. The development team, many of whom had watched silently during my unceremonious exit, now carefully documented every change, explicitly attributing original work to its creators. The CTO of Visionary Tech Solutions personally reached out to understand authcore's architecture, acknowledging its elegant design and requesting permission to use similar patterns in other projects, with appropriate credit, of course. 6 months. Later, when the acquisition was completed, Visionary honored all the agreements Melissa had made. ClaimFast's splash screen now included, originally developed by Emma Chen, alongside the corporate logos. The technical documentation credited me as principal architect, and authcore remained mine, now licensed to multiple insurance platforms across VTS's portfolio, generating more annual revenue than my former salary. But the most satisfying moment came from an unexpected source. At a tech conference the following year, a young developer approached me after my presentation on secure architecture patterns. "I started at Blue Sky 3 months after you left," she said. "Everyone still talks about what happened, how you built this amazing system and then made sure you got credit for it." I smiled, unsure how to respond. "It changed things," she continued. "Now everyone documents their contributions. Everyone makes sure their work is acknowledged. Managers think twice before taking credit for their team's innovations." She hesitated. "You showed us that it's not enough to build something great. You have to claim your place in its story." As she walked away, I realized that what had begun as a simple licensing agreement had become something more meaningful. A small shift in how technical contributions are valued and credited. A reminder that behind every elegant algorithm, every intuitive interface, every seamless user experience is a person who deserves to be seen. The code I'd written for ClaimFast would eventually be replaced, module by module, as technology evolved. But the precedent I'd set, that creators matter, that attribution is non-negotiable, would, hopefully, last much longer. I didn't set out to change corporate culture or make a statement about intellectual property rights. I just wanted recognition for work I was proud of. But sometimes standing up for yourself creates ripples that help others find their voice too. And that, more than any line of code I ever wrote, might be my most meaningful legacy. David, for all his slick presentations and business acumen, never truly understood what made ClaimFast special. He'd wave his hands vaguely when describing the proprietary technology to clients, never once acknowledging that this proprietary technology had a name, a creator, and a story behind every feature. The development team grew as our user base expanded. First came Tyler, a front-end specialist with an eye for detail. Then Nadia, whose database optimizations made the system run twice as fast with half the server load. We became a tight-knit group, staying late to solve particularly tricky problems, celebrating with cheap champagne when we hit major milestones. Those were the good days, when the creation still belonged to its creators. I remember the first time I realized something was changing. We were 6 months post-launch, and ClaimFast had just been featured in Insurance Technology Today as a breakthrough platform. The article mentioned Blue Sky, praised the intuitive interface, and quoted David extensively about the company's innovative approach to problem-solving. What it didn't mention was me, or Tyler, or Nadia, or any of the developers who had actually built the innovation being celebrated. When I pointed this out to David, he shrugged. That's how these things work, Emma. The market doesn't care about individual contributors. They care about the company brand. He tapped the framed article that was already hanging in the reception area. This is what brings in clients. This is what builds value. I didn't argue. What would have been the point? In his world, the world of quarterly reports and investor presentations, individual creation was subsumed into corporate identity. The fact that I'd personally written the algorithm that made ClaimFast faster than any competitor was irrelevant. In the story Blue Sky was telling, innovation emerged from the company itself, as if the organization were a single thinking entity rather than a collection of individual minds. The distance between the development team and executive leadership grew wider as ClaimFast's success continued. We were invited to fewer meetings. Our input was sought less frequently. Decisions about the platform's future were made in boardrooms. We never entered, then handed down to us as directives rather than discussions. We need to pivot toward the small business market, David announced one morning, dropping a PowerPoint printout on my desk. The executive team wants a simplified interface for companies with fewer than 50 employees, ready for demo in 3 weeks. I blinked at him. 3 weeks to redesign the entire user experience? That's not realistic, David. We'd need to... The timeline isn't negotiable. He cut me off. The sales team already has meetings scheduled with target clients. He was already turning to leave. Oh, and we'll need weekend coverage for the next few weeks. I've approved overtime for the team. He hadn't asked if it was technically feasible. Hadn't consulted with anyone who actually understood the system's architecture. Just decided and decreed, as if software could be bent to corporate will through sheer executive authority. Miraculously, we did it. 3 weeks of 18-hour days, of cold pizza and colder coffee, of code reviews at 2 a.m. and bugs fixed at dawn. We rebuilt the interface, streamlined the workflow, and still maintained the security and reliability the platform was known for. The demos went perfectly. The client signed. The following week, Blue Sky issued a press release announcing the new small business solution. David was quoted extensively. The sales team was praised for identifying an underserved market segment. The executive team was credited with strategic vision. The development team went unmentioned, as if the software had manifested through corporate willpower alone. That night, nursing a glass of wine in my apartment for the first time in weeks, I made a decision. I would document everything. Every feature I developed, every problem I solved, every line of code I crafted. Not in the company's systems, where it could be appropriated or overlooked, but in my own private records. It wasn't about credit, not really. It was about truth. About maintaining a connection to what I had created, even as others reshaped the AI narrative around it. This private act of documentation became a ritual. Each evening before leaving the office, I would spend 15 minutes recording the day's work in a journal only I could access. It was oddly comforting, like writing letters to a future self who might someday need to remember what was real. As ClaimFast's user base crossed the 100,000 mark, Blue Sky began attracting attention from larger players in the insurance technology space. Rumors of potential acquisitions circulated through the office. The executive team suddenly seemed perpetually locked in meetings with visitors whose identities were never revealed to staff. That's when Jackson arrived, the new development manager hired directly by David with minimal input from the existing team. His resume was impressive: former tech lead at a major financial software company, degrees from prestigious universities, certifications in all the right methodologies. What it didn't show was his complete lack of experience with claims processing systems or the specific technical challenges our platform had overcome. "I've been reviewing the code base," he announced in his first team meeting. "There are significant opportunities for modernization." He clicked to a slide titled Technical Debt Remediation that listed almost every custom solution we'd built. Solutions that existed precisely because off-the-shelf options couldn't handle the complexity of insurance claims processing. "This proprietary authentication service is particularly concerning," he continued, highlighting Authcore on his list. "It's not following industry-standard patterns. We should migrate to a commercial solution as soon as possible." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. Authcore wasn't just any component. It was the backbone of ClaimFast's security model, handling not only user authentication, but complex permission structures that reflected the hierarchical nature of insurance organizations. More importantly, it was the one piece of the system that existed in a separate repository, under a separate legal arrangement. Authcore was designed specifically for ClaimFast's unique requirements, I explained, keeping my voice even. "Commercial solutions don't support the multi-level approval workflows we've implemented." Jackson smiled with the particular condescension reserved for technical people who don't have manager in their title. "I'm sure we can find a way to adapt standard tools to our needs. No need to maintain custom code when perfectly good solutions exist off the shelf." The meeting continued with Jackson outlining his vision for ClaimFast 2.0. Essentially a complete rewrite of a system that was working perfectly. The team exchanged glances. We all knew what this meant: months of unnecessary work, potential stability issues, and the likely erasure of the careful craftsmanship that had made the platform successful in the first place. After the meeting, Tyler caught up with me in the hallway. "This is insane," he whispered. "He wants to replace components that took us months to perfect with generic tools that won't handle our edge cases." I nodded. Welcome to corporate technology management. The appearance of progress often matters, more than actual improvement. Over the next few weeks, Jackson systematically dismantled the development culture we'd built. Code reviews became performative exercises in finding fault rather than collaborative improvements. Documentation requirements tripled. Every decision required committee approval, except for Jackson's own directives, which were implemented without discussion. Through it all, Authcore remained untouched. Not because Jackson had reconsidered, but because the effort to replace it had been deprioritized in favor of more visible changes. Changes that could be demonstrated in boardroom presentations and investor updates. Changes that looked like progress to people who didn't understand what they were looking at. I continued my private documentation ritual, recording not just technical details now, but the shifting dynamics of the team, the gradual erosion of the collaborative spirit that had once defined our work. It felt increasingly like preparing evidence for a trial that might never take place, but I couldn't stop. Something told me these records would matter someday. The acquisition rumors intensified. David began bringing groups of visitors through the office, serious-looking executives in expensive suits who peered at our monitors as if they could decipher the value of our work through osmosis. We were instructed to focus on looking productive during these tours, as if the actual productivity that had built a successful platform was somehow insufficient. Then came the NDA forms, thick packets of legal language requiring our signatures. Standard procedure during acquisition discussions, HR assured us. Nothing to worry about. The forms included clauses about intellectual property that made me uncomfortable, blanket assertions that everything created during our employment belonged irrevocably and exclusively to Blue Sky. I signed, but added a handwritten note referencing my original employment contract and its appendices regarding Authcore. The HR representative frowned but accepted the modified form. 2 days later, I was called into a meeting with legal. Patricia, the company's lead counsel, sat across from me with my NDA form and employment contract spread before her. Emma, there seems to be some confusion about the ownership of certain components in the ClaimFast system, she began. Your original employment agreement does contain some unusual provisions regarding this Authcore service. I nodded. It was developed before my employment here and licensed to Blue Sky for use with ClaimFast. The arrangement was approved by legal at the time. Patricia's expression suggested this was news to her. I see. And this arrangement was disclosed during the technical documentation phase of the current acquisition discussions? I wasn't included in those discussions, I pointed out. But the licensing terms are embedded in the service configuration and documented in the original contract. They shouldn't be difficult to find during due diligence. She made a note. We may need you to sign an amendment to clarify ownership rights moving forward. The potential acquiring company will want clean title to all technical assets. I'm open to discussing revised licensing terms, I said carefully. But Authcore remains the property of my LLC. That's not negotiable. Patricia studied me for a moment. I'll bring this to the executive team's attention, she finally said. In the meantime, please don't discuss this matter with your colleagues. I left the meeting with a growing sense of unease. If legal was just now discovering the Authcore licensing arrangement, what else had been overlooked in the rush toward acquisition? And more importantly, if they were asking me to sign away rights after the fact, what did that suggest about how my work was being valued or devalued? The next few days passed in strange suspension. I performed my duties as usual, fixed bugs, attended meetings. But there was a new tension in the air, a sense of decisions being made just out of earshot. David, normally visible in his glass-walled office or striding purposefully through the development area, was notably absent. Jackson seemed unusually pleased with himself. Then came Tuesday morning. David's cologne, his practiced corporate tone. The folder on my desk containing a separation agreement with terms that effectively erased 2 years of my professional life. As security escorted me from the building, cardboard box in arms, I felt oddly calm. Not because I had anticipated this exact scenario, but because some part of me had always known that creation and credit existed in uneasy relationship in corporate environments. That the people who build things are not always the people who own them, at least not in the eyes of those who write the checks. But Authcore was different. Authcore had been mine before Blue Sky, would be mine after Blue Sky, and remained mine through every line of code and every user authentication in between. The licensing terms weren't an afterthought or a trick. They were a clear agreement between two business entities. An agreement that David, in his haste to clean house before the acquisition, had either forgotten or dismissed as unimportant. At home, I set the cardboard box on my kitchen counter and opened my personal laptop. The Blue Sky VPN access was already deactivated, standard procedure for terminated employees. But I didn't need VPN access to log into the Authcore management console. The service had been designed with independent administration capabilities, specifically to maintain the separation between it and Blue Sky's systems. The dashboard showed business as usual. Thousands of active sessions, authentication requests processing normally, security protocols functioning as designed. I didn't make any changes, didn't need to. The system would continue operating normally until its next scheduled license validation check, a routine verification that the terms of use were still being met. That check would occur in exactly 13 days, according to the system logs. When it ran, it would discover that one of the primary conditions, my active employment at Blue Sky, was no longer valid. At that point, following its programmed protocols, Authcore would begin a graceful shutdown sequence. No data would be lost, no sudden crashes would occur. The system would simply stop authenticating new sessions and allow existing ones to complete their natural life cycle. In effect, ClaimFast would slowly, gently come to a halt, like a car running out of gas rather than suffering a mechanical failure. I closed the laptop and poured myself a glass of wine, not in celebration or commiseration, but simply to mark the moment. 2 years of my professional life had ended with a folder and a cardboard box. The coming days would determine what that ending really meant. For me, for Blue Sky, and for the platform I'd built with such care. The next morning, I began the practical business of unemployment. Updated my LinkedIn profile, reached out to former colleagues at other companies, applied for positions that looked interesting. All the while, a calendar in the back of my mind was counting down. 12 days until the authentication service would perform its validation check. On day 4, I received my first call from Blue Sky, a developer I'd worked with but didn't know well, calling from his personal phone. Emma, hey, weird question. That authentication service, Authcore, where's the main documentation for it? We're trying to track down some configuration details. The technical specs are in the development wiki, I replied, but the service itself is pretty well self-documented in the code comments. Yeah, about that. It seems like the repository link is broken. Jackson's trying to get access to review some security settings. I suppressed a smile. The repository isn't hosted on Blue Sky's systems. It's externally maintained. A pause. Externally. By who? By me. Through my LLC. It's a licensed component, not an owned asset. Another, longer pause. Huh. That's not what Jackson's been saying. Anyway, thanks. I'll figure something out. The call ended, but I knew it was just the beginning. They were starting to realize that something wasn't quite as it seemed with ClaimFast's authentication system. On day 7, my phone rang again. This time, Jackson himself. Emma, he began without preamble. We need the access credentials for the Authcore repository. There are some modifications we need to make for the acquisition transition. His tone suggested this was a simple administrative matter, a loose end to be tied up. As if my abrupt termination had been a minor restructuring detail rather than a complete severing of professional ties. Authcore is licensed to Blue Sky through my company, I explained calmly. Any modifications would need to be handled through a formal change request process, as outlined in the original service agreement. Jackson's voice hardened. That's not workable in our current timeline. Just send over the credentials and we'll handle any paperwork afterwards. I'm afraid I can't do that. The service agreement is quite specific about modification protocols. I'd be happy to set up a consulting arrangement to implement any necessary changes, though. My rate is $200 per hour, with a minimum engagement of 20 hours. The silence that followed contained multitudes, surprise, anger, the recalculation of someone who had thought they held all the cards, discovering a hand they hadn't counted on. This is company property, Emma. Developed on company time with company resources. Actually, it isn't. If you check my original employment contract, Appendix C specifically addresses the licensing arrangement for Authcore. It was developed before I joined Blue Sky and is licensed for use, not owned outright. I'll have legal review this, he snapped and ended the call. I had no doubt he would. and I had no doubt what they would find, exactly what I'd told him. The question was, what would happen next? Would they reach out to negotiate a proper transition? Or would they attempt to work around the licensing terms, perhaps trying to reverse engineer the service or build a replacement before the validation check occurred? On day 10, I got my answer. An email from Patricia in legal. Emma, upon review of your employment agreement, we acknowledge the unique status of the Authcore service. We would like to discuss terms for either purchasing the service outright or establishing a long-term licensing arrangement that would survive the upcoming acquisition. Please let me know your availability for a meeting to discuss options. The email was professional, respectful, and completely devoid of the condescension that had characterized my final interactions with David and Jackson. Legal, at least, recognized the reality of the situation. They needed my cooperation more than I needed theirs. I responded with my availability and a preliminary term sheet outlining options for either scenario, acquisition or licensing. My terms weren't punitive or excessive. They simply reflected the actual market value of a critical authentication service that was already seamlessly integrated with their primary product. The meeting was scheduled for day 12, one day before the validation check would occur. I didn't mention this timing in my correspondence. Let them discover the urgency on their own. The meeting took place via video conference rather than in person, a small mercy, as I wasn't eager to return to the building where my professional contributions had been so thoroughly devalued. Patricia was there, along with an outside counsel I didn't recognize. Notably absent were David and Jackson. Thank you for meeting with us, Emma, Patricia began. We've reviewed your term sheet and have some questions about the proposed arrangements. What followed was a straightforward business negotiation, discussion of terms, pricing models, support expectations. The attorneys were professional and thorough, treating me as a legitimate business counterparty rather than a former employee causing trouble. It was refreshing, if somewhat surreal. Near the end of the meeting, I decided to address the elephant in the room. I notice we haven't discussed the timeline for finalizing these arrangements. Patricia and the outside counsel exchanged glances. We understand there may be some operational considerations that make timely resolution important, Patricia said carefully. So they knew. Someone had discovered the validation check mechanism, either through code review or system logs. They understood that the clock was ticking. The standard license validation process runs on a preset schedule, I confirmed. Without a valid license, the service will begin graceful shutdown procedures. And when is the next validation scheduled to occur? The outside counsel asked. Tomorrow at midnight, Eastern Time. Their expressions didn't change, but the energy in the virtual meeting shifted perceptibly. I see, Patricia said. In that case, we should aim to have an agreement executed by close of business today. Would that be feasible from your perspective? Absolutely. I have the necessary paperwork prepared and can sign as soon as we reach acceptable terms. By 5:30 p.m., it was done. I had signed a new licensing agreement that 1. Established clear ownership of Authcore by my LLC. 2. Provided Blue Sky and any successor company with a perpetual license to use the service with ClaimFast 3. Required appropriate attribution in technical documentation. 4. Set reasonable compensation for ongoing maintenance and support. 5. Granted me consulting rights for any major modifications to the service. Within an hour of receiving the countersigned agreement, I updated the Authcore configuration to recognize the new licensing terms. The validation check would now pass successfully, and ClaimFast would continue operating without interruption. As I closed my laptop that evening, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly. My work had been recognized as valuable, my ownership rights respected, but also a lingering sadness for what could have been, a collaborative environment where creation and credit existed in proper balance, where building something excellent was rewarded with more than just a cardboard box and an escort to the door. The next morning, I received a LinkedIn message from Melissa, Blue Sky's CEO, someone I had met exactly once during my entire tenure at the company. "Emma, I've just been briefed on the Authcore situation. I want to personally apologize for how your departure was handled. It's clear that your contributions to Claim Fast were not properly recognized or respected. I'd like to discuss this further if you're willing. There may be a role for you in the newly structured organization post-acquisition." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. The offer was tempting in some ways. A chance to return to the platform I'd built, perhaps with more authority and recognition than before. But something held me back. Once trust is broken in a professional relationship, can it ever be fully restored? Did I want to return to an environment where my worth had only been recognized when my absence created a crisis? "Thank you for reaching out," I finally wrote back. "I'm open to a conversation about ongoing support for Authcore through my consulting services, but I've accepted a new position that begins next month." This wasn't strictly true. I had interviews scheduled but hadn't yet accepted a new role. Sometimes a small fiction serves a greater truth. In this case, the truth that I couldn't go back, could only move forward. The acquisition was announced the following week. Visionary Tech Solutions, a major player in insurance software, had purchased Blue Sky for an undisclosed sum to incorporate the innovative Claim Fast platform into its suite of industry-leading solutions. The press release mentioned the team of skilled developers who had created Claim Fast, a small but meaningful acknowledgement that hadn't appeared in previous company communications. A separate, smaller announcement appeared on the technical section of Visionary's website, noting that Claim Fast's authentication is powered by Authcore, a service developed by EC Solutions LLC under exclusive license. My professional corporation's name in print linked to my creation, a small victory, but one that mattered to me. In the months that followed, I did provide consulting services to Visionary as they integrated Claim Fast into their larger ecosystem. The fees from this arrangement, combined with the ongoing licensing revenue from Authcore, gave me the financial freedom to be selective about my next full-time position. I took my time, evaluating potential employers not just on technical challenges and compensation, but on how they recognized and credited individual contributions within their organization. Eventually, I joined a smaller company where the founders were still actively involved in product development, people who understood the personal investment that goes into creating software. My contract included clear provisions about intellectual property, attribution requirements, and the boundary between company ownership and creator recognition. The story could end there, a tidy narrative about standing up for one's work and being validated in the end. But there was one more chapter that I didn't anticipate. Almost a year after leaving Blue Sky, I received an email from someone I didn't recognize, a developer named Priya who had joined Visionary after the acquisition. "You don't know me," she wrote, "but everyone here knows you, or at least they know about the Authcore situation as it's now called in company lore. What you did has changed how things work around here. All external components are now clearly documented with ownership and licensing terms prominently displayed. Developer contributions are explicitly credited in release notes. There's even a new policy requiring attribution for major feature development." She continued, "I'm writing because I wanted you to know that your stand didn't just protect your own work. It created ripples that are still moving through the organization. As someone just starting her career, seeing this shift has been incredibly valuable. It's shown me that good work deserves recognition, and that standing up for your creation isn't just permitted, it's necessary." I read the email several times, saving it to a special folder that I rarely accessed but never considered deleting. It contained the private documentation I'd maintained during my time at Blue Sky, my record of what I had built and why it mattered. Looking back now, I realize that what happened wasn't really about code or contracts, or even corporate politics. It was about the fundamental human desire to be connected to what we create, to have our work seen not just as an asset on a balance sheet, but as an extension of ourselves, carrying our imprint even as it takes on a life of its own. Software, like any creation, bears the mark of its makers. In the elegant solution to a thorny problem, in the careful handling of edge cases, in the thoughtful user experience decisions. These are signatures as unique and personal as any written name. They deserve to be acknowledged, preserved, and respected. The authentication service that started this story continues to run, validating users and sessions day after day. Most people who use ClaimFast will never know it exists, much less who created it. But in the technical documentation, in the system logs, in the code itself, my name remains. A small reminder that behind every digital tool is a human hand that shaped it. That reminder, more than any financial settlement or professional vindication, is what I fought for, and what in the end, I managed to protect. 3 months after finalizing the licensing agreement with Visionary Tech Solutions, I received an unexpected invitation. It wasn't to a job interview or a consulting gig, but to speak at InsurTech Summit, one of the industry's premier conferences. The topic: intellectual property in the age of corporate software development. My first instinct was to decline. I had moved on, professionally and emotionally. The licensing revenue from Authcore provided a comfortable cushion while I explored new projects, and I wasn't particularly interested in revisiting the blue sky chapter of my career in such a public forum. But curiosity got the better of me. Who had nominated me as a speaker? Why this topic? And why now? The conference coordinator was forthcoming when I asked. Melissa Chen from Visionary Tech Solutions suggested you, she explained. She thought your perspective would be valuable given the recent changes in how their organization approaches developer attribution. Melissa, Blue Sky's former CEO who had transitioned to a senior role at Visionary after the acquisition. The same executive who had reached out to me only after discovering that a critical component of their flagship product was outside their control. Her suggestion struck me as calculated rather than magnanimous. Still, the platform was compelling. A chance to speak directly to an industry that routinely subsumed individual technical contributions into corporate achievements. A chance to make visible what typically remained hidden, the human creativity behind digital tools. I accepted the invitation with one condition: complete editorial control over my presentation. No corporate review, no suggested talking points. Just my authentic experience, shared on my terms. The weeks leading up to the conference were busier than I expected. My new role at Equisoft, a startup focused on financial equity analysis tools, was challenging in the best way. The founders were technical themselves and had structured the company deliberately to recognize individual contributions. Each major feature was credited to its primary developers in both documentation and marketing materials. Team members held shares in the patents their work generated. Creation and credit existed in refreshing alignment. I worked on my presentation during evenings, refining my message until it felt right. Neither a corporate takedown nor a personal vindication, but a thoughtful examination of how intellectual property functions in collaborative environments. I didn't name Blue Sky explicitly in my slides, referring instead to a previous employer and a claims processing platform. Those who knew the story would recognize it. Those who didn't would still understand the principles at stake. The conference itself was held at a gleaming hotel in downtown Chicago, all glass and polished surfaces reflecting the lake beyond. I arrived the night before my presentation, settling into a room paid for by the conference organizers, a small marker of professional respect that wasn't lost on me. That evening, at the speaker's reception, I found myself face-to-face with Melissa for the first time since leaving Blue Sky. She looked exactly as I remembered, polished, confident, the kind of executive presence that's cultivated over decades of corporate ascension. "Emma," she said warmly, extending her hand. "I'm so glad you accepted the invitation." Your session tomorrow is generating quite a buzz. I shook her hand, maintaining a professional smile. I was surprised by the nomination, to be honest. Were you? She tilted her head slightly. You shouldn't be. What happened between you and Blue Sky? It changed things at Visionary. For the better, I think. How so? It forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we handle intellectual property and developer recognition. The legal team nearly had a collective heart attack when they realized a core component of our newly acquired platform had licensing terms they hadn't properly vetted. I couldn't help but smile at that. I imagine that made for some interesting meetings. You have no idea. She sipped her drink thoughtfully. We've implemented new protocols for technical asset management. Proper documentation of all externally licensed components. Clear attribution standards for internal development. It's actually become a selling point with potential acquisitions. We can promise developers that their work won't be anonymized. Post-acquisition. That's surprisingly progressive. It's surprisingly practical, she corrected. Talent retention is a major factor in acquisition success. Developers who feel their work is respected are developers who stay to build the next generation of products. I studied her carefully. This wasn't the contrite executive who had messaged me on LinkedIn after discovering the Authcore licensing issue. This was a pragmatic business leader who had identified a weakness in her organization and addressed it systematically. Not because it was the right thing to do, necessarily, but because it was the smart thing to do. And David? I asked, unable to resist. How did he adapt to these new protocols? A flicker of something, amusement, discomfort, crossed her face. David is no longer with the organization. The Authcore situation highlighted some gaps in his management approach that weren't compatible with Visionary's culture. So he had paid a price after all. Not because of how he had treated me, but because his oversight had created a legal and operational vulnerability that threatened the acquisition. Corporate justice operated on its own principles, distinct from personal fairness, but occasionally intersecting with it. Well, I said, raising my glass slightly. Here's to proper documentation of technical assets. She clinked her glass against mine. Indeed. I look forward to your presentation tomorrow. As she moved on to greet other attendees, I wondered if her support for my speaking engagement was genuine professional respect or simply damage control. A way to demonstrate that Visionary had learned its lesson and embraced a more progressive approach to developer recognition. Probably both, I decided. In the corporate world, principles and pragmatism were rarely mutually exclusive. The next morning, I stood before a packed conference room. Industry executives, technical leaders, and developers filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. My presentation was scheduled for the main stage rather than one of the breakout rooms, another indication that the topic had struck a chord beyond my personal experience. Software development exists at an unusual intersection, I began, advancing. To my first slide. It's simultaneously artistic creation and commercial product, individual expression and corporate asset, personal innovation and team achievement. This intersection creates natural tensions around ownership, credit, and recognition. Over the next 40 minutes, I walked the audience through the evolution of intellectual property in software development, from the early days of individual programmers creating entire systems to the modern environment of team-based development within corporate structures. I outlined different models for balancing individual recognition with corporate ownership, from open source attribution to patent sharing. And then I shared my story, not as a victim narrative, but as a case study in what happens when these balances are disrupted. How the dissolution of the connection between creator and creation doesn't just harm individuals, it creates business vulnerabilities and unnecessary risks. The Authcore situation could have been avoided with proper documentation and respect. For existing agreements, I explained, using the term Priya had mentioned in her email, the auth-core situation that had become part of company lore. Instead, assumptions about ownership created a technical crisis that threatened service continuity for thousands of clients. From the back of the room, I noticed Melissa nodding slightly, acknowledging the truth of this assessment even as several executives around her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The solution isn't just better legal review, I continued. It's a cultural shift in how we think about creation within corporate environments. Developers don't check their creative identities at the door when they accept employment. Their personal craft, problem-solving approaches, and innovative thinking remain integral to who they are and how they work. I advanced to my final slide, a simple framework for balanced attribution that respected both corporate ownership and individual contribution. A model that treated technical creation as both asset and achievement, both product and craft. When we acknowledge the human element in software development, I concluded, we don't diminish its commercial value. We enhance it, because developers who feel recognized for past contributions are the ones who will be motivated to create future innovations. Recognition isn't just fair, it's smart business. The applause was immediate and sustained, not polite conference clapping, but genuine appreciation. As I gathered my notes, a line formed at the front of the room. Developers wanting to share similar experiences. Managers asking about implementation details for attribution systems. Executives curious about the legal frameworks I'd mentioned. Among them was a young woman in her early 20s, clutching a conference program and looking simultaneously nervous and determined. I just started at Visionary 3 months ago, she said when her turn came. Your auth-core system was part of my onboarding, not just learning how it works technically, but understanding its history and ownership structure. She took a deep breath. They use it as a case study now in how to properly document and attribute technical components. I wasn't sure how to respond. The idea that my standoff with Blue Sky had become an instructional anecdote for new employees was both vindicating and surreal. Is it weird? She asked, misinterpreting my silence. Having your work situation turned into a corporate learning moment? I smiled. A little weird, yes, but if it helps create better practices, I suppose it's worth it. She nodded earnestly. It made me think differently about my own work, about documenting what I create and being clear about my contributions. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, and about reading contracts very carefully before signing them. That made me laugh. Always a good practice in this industry. Throughout the rest of the conference, I was approached by developers with similar stories, moments when their work had been separated from their identity, when creation and credit had diverged. Some had fought back like I had. Others had simply moved on, carrying the lesson into new environments. All of them seemed relieved to hear the experience articulated publicly, to have the invisible dynamics of corporate technical creation brought into the light. On the final evening of the conference, I found myself at a rooftop reception overlooking the Chicago skyline. The sunset painted the buildings in gold, the lake a deepening blue beyond. I was enjoying a moment of quiet when a familiar figure approached. Your presentation has been the talk of the conference, Melissa said, joining me at the railing. I've had 3 CEOs ask me about our attribution policies at Visionary. And what did you tell them? The truth, that we implemented them after learning a valuable lesson about the relationship between technical creators and their work. She gave me a wry smile. I may have left out the part where we learned this lesson because one of our acquired assets stopped functioning when we fired its creator. A slight simplification of the narrative, I agreed. But the essence is accurate. Your stand changed our policies. She gazed out at the skyline. You know, when legal first brought the auth-core licensing issue to my attention, I was furious. Not at you, at our own processes that had allowed such a critical oversight. But now I'm almost grateful it happened. Grateful? I couldn't hide my surprise. It forced us to examine assumptions we hadn't even realized we were making. About ownership, about the relationship between employment and creation, about the human element in technical development. She turned to face me directly. The changes we've implemented as a result have strengthened our position with both current employees and acquisition targets. It was a quintessentially corporate perspective, reframing a potential crisis as a growth opportunity, finding business value in what had begun as a human conflict. But I couldn't deny the positive outcome. Systems had changed. Policies had evolved. Future developers would work in an environment that recognized their contributions more explicitly. The offer still stands, Melissa said after a moment. If you ever want to come back, not to Blue Sky, which hardly exists as a separate entity anymore, but to Visionary. We could use someone with your technical skills and your perspective on intellectual property governance. I considered the offer briefly. There was a certain poetic closure in the idea of returning to the organization that had once discarded me, now with explicit recognition of my value. But something in me resisted the symmetry of that narrative. I appreciate the offer, I said sincerely, but I'm happy where I am. Equisoft has built the kind of attribution culture you're trying to create at Visionary from the ground up. It's in their DNA, not added after a crisis. Melissa nodded, unsurprised. I thought you might say that, but the door remains open. She extended her hand. Thank you, Emma, for the presentation and for the wake-up call last year. Sometimes organizations need to be shaken out of their assumptions. As we shook hands, I realized we had reached a peculiar equilibrium. Not friendship exactly, but mutual professional respect born from conflict and resolution. She had learned something valuable from our standoff, and so had I. That standing up for the connection between creator and creation wasn't just a personal matter, but a systemic one. That individual actions could create ripples of change through corporate structures that seemed immovable. After the conference, I returned to Equisoft with renewed energy and focus. The experience of articulating my philosophy on technical attribution had clarified my own professional priorities and boundaries. I found myself being more explicit about documenting my work, more intentional about crediting others' contributions, more aware of the delicate balance between team achievement and individual creation. 6 months later, Authcore, my authentication service that had inadvertently become a catalyst for organizational change, reached a milestone: 1 million active users across multiple platforms. What had begun as a personal project before my time at Blue Sky had evolved into a significant software service in its own right, now licensed to 3 different companies, including Visionary. To mark the occasion, I spent a weekend refactoring some of the original code. It wasn't strictly necessary. The service ran efficiently and securely. But there was something deeply satisfying about revisiting my earlier work, seeing the decisions I had made with fresh eyes, improving what could be improved while preserving what had been well designed from the start. As I worked, I thought about the strange journey this code had taken, from personal project to corporate asset to contested intellectual property to recognized innovation. The code itself hadn't changed significantly throughout this evolution. What had changed was the human context around it, the understanding of who had created it, who owned it, who controlled its future development. That Monday, I received an unexpected email from Patricia, Blue Sky's former legal counsel who had negotiated the Authcore licensing agreement during the crisis. She had moved on to a new role at a different company, but had apparently kept track of Visionary's organizational changes. I thought you might find this interesting, she wrote, attaching a document titled Visionary Tech Solutions Intellectual Property and Attribution Guidelines. It was a comprehensive framework for managing technical assets, documenting ownership, structures, and attributing individual contributions within corporate products. Section 3. 4 caught my attention immediately. In case of pre-existing intellectual property licensed to the company through individual developers, explicit acknowledgement must appear in both technical documentation and, where appropriate, user-facing materials. The following example made me smile. Model: Authcore Authentication Service, developed by Emma Chen and licensed through EC Solutions LLC. For more information, see full licensing terms in the legal reference database. They had made my case. Study their template. My insistence on recognition had become their standard for attribution. It was, in its way, the most complete victory I could have imagined. Not just personal acknowledgement, but systemic change. In the 2 years since that pivotal Tuesday morning when David had appeared at my desk with termination papers, much had changed, both in my professional circumstances and in the broader conversation about intellectual property and software development. The conference presentation had led to speaking engagements at other industry events, opportunities to shape policies at multiple organizations, and eventually, a book contract for a guide to intellectual property rights for developers. But perhaps, the most meaningful change was cultural rather than structural. The developers I met through these engagements increasingly expected attribution for their work. They entered employment negotiations with clearer understanding of their intellectual property rights. They documented their contributions methodically. They read contracts carefully, especially Appendix C. This shift wasn't universal, of course. Many companies still treated software development as an anonymous technical function rather than a creative discipline. Many developers still found their innovations subsumed into corporate identities without acknowledgement. But the conversation had begun. The invisible had become visible. The assumed had become questioned. One evening, as I was finalizing a chapter of my book, I received a LinkedIn message from a name I didn't immediately recognize: David Marshall. It took me a moment to place it. David, Blue Sky's former COO, who had fired me without reading my employment contract carefully enough to understand the Authcore licensing terms. "I saw you're speaking at Tech Future Summit next month," he wrote. "I've been following your work on developer attribution with interest. After leaving Visionary, I've been consulting with startups on sustainable growth models, and your framework has influenced my thinking about technical team structures. If you're open to it, I'd welcome the chance to discuss potential collaboration on guidelines for emerging companies." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. The David I had known at Blue Sky had been dismissive of individual technical contributions, focused solely on corporate achievements that could be presented to investors and clients. Had that perspective genuinely evolved? Or was this simply an attempt to associate himself with ideas that had gained industry traction? After careful consideration, I wrote back, "Thank you for reaching out, David. I'd be interested to hear more about how your thinking on technical attribution has developed since Blue Sky. Perhaps we could meet for coffee during the summit to discuss potential alignment in our approaches." His response came quickly. "I appreciate your openness, Emma. Blue Sky, and particularly the Authcore situation, taught me valuable lessons about the relationship between developers and their creations. Sometimes the most effective learning comes from mistakes, especially those with significant consequences. I look forward to our conversation." I closed my laptop, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was a certain symmetry to this potential collaboration. The executive who had once separated me from my creation, now acknowledging the importance of maintaining that connection for other developers. Whether his conversion was genuine or pragmatic didn't matter as much as the result. Another voice advocating for proper attribution in technical work. That night, I dreamed of code, not the stress dreams of debugging under pressure that sometimes haunted developers, but flowing sequences of elegant solutions, each signed with the name of its creator. In the morning, I added a dedication to my book manuscript for every developer whose name doesn't appear in the products they've built. Your fingerprints are there, even when your signature isn't. The following week, I received an email from the product manager at Visionary who oversaw ClaimFast integration. The platform had reached 2 million active users with Authcore seamlessly, processing authentications across their expanded client base. The message included a screenshot of the updated About page in the ClaimFast documentation, which now featured a clear attribution section listing primary contributors to the platform's development, my name prominent among them. It wasn't about ego or public recognition. Most users would never click through to that page, never see those names, never know who had crafted the tools they relied on daily. But for the developers whose work was acknowledged, it represented something profound: the preservation of the connection between creator and creation, even within corporate structures that typically obscured individual contributions. As I prepared for my next speaking engagement, I reflected on what had ultimately mattered most in the Blue Sky conflict. It wasn't the licensing revenue, though that had provided financial security during the transition to new opportunities. It wasn't the professional vindication, though that had been undeniably satisfying. It wasn't even the systemic changes at Visionary, though those represented meaningful progress. What mattered most was the principle that creation and credit should remain connected, that the human element in software development deserved recognition, that technical innovation wasn't an anonymous corporate function, but a creative discipline, practiced by specific individuals with unique approaches and insights. This principle wasn't radical. It didn't undermine legitimate corporate ownership or challenge reasonable intellectual property structures. It simply acknowledged a truth that had always existed beneath the surface of corporate software development: that behind every feature, every algorithm, every elegant solution was a human mind that deserved recognition for what it had built. The Tuesday morning when David had appeared at my desk with termination papers had seemed like an ending. The severing of my connection to ClaimFast, the platform I had built from nothing into something valuable. Instead, it had become a beginning, the first step in a larger conversation about how we acknowledge the human element in technical creation. Authcore continued to run flawlessly, validating users and sessions day after day across multiple platforms. Most people who relied on it would never know it existed, much less who had created it. But in the technical documentation, in the licensing agreements, in the attribution pages of the products it supported, my name remained. A small but persistent reminder that software doesn't emerge from corporate entities, but from the minds and hands of individual creators. That reminder, more than any financial settlement or professional achievement, represented the true resolution of the conflict that had begun on that Tuesday morning. Creation and credit had been reunited. The connection between builder and built had been restored. The human element in technical innovation had become visible. And that visibility, that acknowledgement of the personal within the corporate, the creative within the commercial, would hopefully extend beyond my individual case to touch the work lives of developers everywhere. Because ultimately, what I had fought for wasn't just my own recognition, but the principle that all technical creation deserves to maintain its connection to its creators, not just for the benefit of those individuals, but for the integrity of the creative process itself. The code I had written would eventually be replaced as technology evolved. The platforms it supported would someday become obsolete. But the principle of connecting creation and credit, of recognizing the human element in technical innovation, could endure, shaping how organizations approach software development for generations to come. That lasting influence, more than any line of code or technical achievement, might be the most meaningful contribution of all. 5 years had passed since the Authcore licensing dispute that changed the trajectory of my career. What had begun as a painful professional separation had evolved into something I never could have anticipated: a movement for developer attribution. That was gradually reshaping how the tech industry approached intellectual property. I sat in my home office, reviewing the final edits for the second edition of my book, Code Signatures: Developer Rights in Corporate Environments. The first edition had become something of a standard reference for both technical professionals and legal teams specializing in software intellectual property. This updated version incorporated case studies from companies that had implemented attribution frameworks based on the principles I had advocated. My phone buzzed with a calendar notification: TechMinds panel, Developer Attribution in Enterprise Software, 30-min. I closed my laptop and prepared for the virtual session, adjusting my webcam and checking my background. These panel discussions had become a regular part of my professional life. Opportunities to advance the conversation about proper recognition for technical creators within corporate structures. Today's panel included chief technology officers from 3 major software companies, a legal expert in intellectual property, and me, still somewhat surprised to find myself positioned as an authority on developer attribution rather than simply a practitioner of software development. The story of Authcore and its aftermath had transformed me into an unexpected advocate for a cause I had stumbled into through my own experience. As I connected to the video call, familiar faces appeared in their respective squares. Executives I now knew by their first names, peers in this evolving conversation about the relationship between creators and corporations in the digital age. Once, I had been just another developer lost in the anonymity of corporate technical teams. Now, I was part of shaping how those teams were recognized for their contributions. Emma, we were just discussing the preliminary results from the developer recognition study, said Marcus, the moderator and founder of TechMinds. Apparently, companies with formal attribution policies are showing 23% better retention of senior technical talent compared to those without such policies. I nodded. That aligns with what we've been seeing anecdotally. Developers aren't just looking for competitive compensation anymore. They want their work acknowledged. Attribution has become a factor in recruiting and retention. This represents a significant shift in industry culture, noted Janelle, CTO of Enterprise Solutions, Group and a recent convert to attribution frameworks. 5 years ago, the standard approach was to subsume all technical contributions into corporate identity. Now, we're seeing explicit attribution not just in documentation, but in marketing materials and investor presentations. The challenge, added Michael from the legal panel, has been establishing clear boundaries between legitimate corporate ownership and appropriate individual recognition. The frameworks Emma outlined in her book have been helpful in navigating that balance. As the discussion continued, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The termination that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately led to a more authentic alignment between my professional work and my values. The licensing dispute that had felt like a desperate last stand had catalyzed an important conversation about the human element in software development. After the panel concluded, I received a private message from Janelle. Your attribution framework has transformed our development culture. Senior engineers who were considering leaving have specifically mentioned our new recognition policies as factors in their decision to stay. Thank you for pushing this conversation forward. These messages had become more frequent over the past year. Executives and technical leaders acknowledging the positive impact of attribution policies on their organizations. It was validation of the principle I had fought for, that recognizing the human creators behind technical innovations wasn't just fair but strategically beneficial for the companies themselves. My doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. When I opened the door, I found a courier with a small package requiring signature. I wasn't expecting any deliveries, but signed for it nonetheless, curious about its contents. Back at my desk, I opened the package to find a sleek black box with a simple silver emboss. Claim Fast Enterprise, 5th Anniversary Edition. Inside was a commemorative crystal cube, elegantly etched with the Claim Fast logo and a list of names, the key contributors to the platform's development over the years. My name appeared first with the designation Founding Developer and Creator of Authcore Authentication System. A note accompanied the cube, handwritten on Visionary Tech Solutions letterhead. Emma, as ClaimFast celebrates its 5th anniversary under visionary stewardship, we wanted to acknowledge the foundations upon which our success has been built. Your vision and technical implementation created a platform that has now processed over 20 million insurance claims, saving our clients countless hours and revolutionizing their operations. The developer attribution policies you advocated have become integral to our corporate culture, allowing us to attract and retain exceptional technical talent while honoring the individual creativity that drives innovation. With appreciation for your lasting contribution, Melissa Chen, President, Insurance Technologies Division, Visionary Tech Solutions. I turned the crystal cube in my hands, watching how the light caught the etched names, mine and others who had contributed to the platform over the years. It was a small gesture in the grand scheme of things, but its symbolism wasn't lost on me. 5 years ago, my name had been consciously omitted from any public recognition of ClaimFast's success. Now, it was literally etched in crystal, a permanent acknowledgement of my role in creating something of value. The journey from that Tuesday morning when David had appeared at my desk with termination papers to this moment of formal recognition had been unpredictable, challenging, and ultimately transformative, not just for me personally, but for how I understood the relationship between technical creators and the organizations that employed them. Later that afternoon, I had a scheduled call with my publisher to discuss promotion plans for the 2nd edition of my book. As I waited for the call to connect, I glanced at my calendar for the coming month. 2 conference keynotes, a university guest lecture on intellectual property rights for computer science students, a consultation with a major tech firm revising their attribution policies, and the official launch of the Developer Attribution Initiative, a nonprofit I had co-founded to provide resources and advocacy for technical professionals navigating intellectual property issues in corporate environments. The pre-orders for the 2nd edition are strong, my publisher said when the call connected. There's clearly growing interest in this topic across the industry. The case studies from companies that have implemented your framework have been particularly compelling to corporate readers. That's good to hear, I replied. The goal has always been practical implementation, not just theoretical discussion. We've also had inquiries about translation rights, particularly for Japanese, German, and Mandarin editions. The conversation is clearly extending beyond English-speaking markets. The international interest was a new development, an indication that the questions around developer attribution and recognition transcended specific corporate cultures or national boundaries. The fundamental relationship between creators and their creations was universal, even as its expression varied across different organizational contexts. After the call, I took a walk through my neighborhood, enjoying the autumn air and the changing leaves. These walks had become an important part of my thinking process, a way to step back from the details of specific projects and consider the broader implications of the work I was doing. The past 5 years had taught me that technical creation was inherently personal, even within corporate structures that often tried to render it anonymous. The code I wrote carried my particular approach to problem solving, my specific aesthetic preferences for elegant solutions, my unique way of addressing edge cases. These weren't just implementations of business requirements. They were expressions of my technical creativity, my code signature, as tangible and distinctive as a painter's brushstrokes or a composer's harmonies. What I had fought for at Blue Sky wasn't just my name on a documentation page, but the recognition of this fundamental truth, that behind every feature, every algorithm, every user interface was a human mind making creative decisions that shaped the final product. That the connection between creator and creation mattered, not just for the developer's sense of professional identity, but for the integrity of the development process itself. As I rounded the corner toward home, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I might have let it go to voicemail, but something prompted me to answer. "Is this Emma Chen?" asked a voice I didn't recognize. "Yes, it is." "My name is Sophia Martinez. I'm the lead developer for a healthcare management platform at MedSync Technologies. She paused. I read your book last year and it changed how I approached a situation with my employer. I slowed my pace, giving the conversation my full attention. I'm glad to hear it was helpful. Our company was being acquired by a larger healthcare tech firm, she continued. During the process, I realized that a diagnostic algorithm I'd developed, one that formed the core of our platform's functionality, wasn't properly documented as my work. It was just labeled as proprietary technology in the acquisition materials. And what did you do? I followed the approach you outlined in Chapter 7, gathered documentation showing the development history, identified the specific terms in my employment agreement covering intellectual property, and approached legal directly rather than going through my manager. Her voice grew more confident as she spoke. I didn't ask them to change the ownership. That rightfully belonged to the company, but to properly attribute the algorithm's development to me and all technical documentation going forward. How did they respond? Initially with resistance, but when I presented the business case for attribution, the value to both the acquiring company and to me as a continuing employee, they reconsidered. The final acquisition documents included proper attribution, and the acquiring company has actually expanded the practice to other key components of their technology stack. I smiled, genuinely moved by her story. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. Proper attribution doesn't undermine corporate ownership. It simply acknowledges the human creativity that powers technical innovation. Your book gave me the vocabulary and framework to advocate for myself effectively, Sophia said. I wanted you to know that your work is making a difference for developers like me who might otherwise see their contributions rendered anonymous in corporate transitions. After we said goodbye, I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, struck by the ripple effects of what had begun as a personal conflict over a single authentication service. Sophia's experience was one of dozens I'd heard over the past few years. Stories of developers finding ways to maintain the connection between their creative work and their professional identity, even within corporate structures that traditionally obscured individual contributions. When I reached home, I found an email from the university where I was scheduled to guest lecture the following month. The computer science department was requesting permission to record my presentation for their digital archive, noting that the topic of intellectual property rights had become increasingly relevant to their curriculum. Students were entering the workplace with greater awareness of these issues, and the faculty wanted to ensure they were prepared to navigate them effectively. This was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the Authcore dispute. That future, generations of technical professionals would begin their careers with a clearer understanding of their relationship to what they created, that they would see attribution not as an exceptional accommodation, but as a standard practice in healthy development cultures. The next morning, I received a notification that someone had mentioned me in a social media post. It was a thread from a technical conference where attribution in development had been a featured topic. One of the panelists had referenced my case as a turning point in how the industry approached the relationship between developers and their creations. Before the Authcore situation, the post read, most developers accepted anonymity as the cost of corporate employment. Their innovations became corporate assets with no public connection to their creators. The Chen case changed that calculus, demonstrating that attribution could coexist with legitimate corporate ownership, that recognition and rights weren't mutually exclusive. It was strange to see my personal experience referred to as the Chen case or the Authcore situation, transformed from a painful professional conflict into a reference point in industry discussions. The distance created by this terminology allowed the principles at stake to take precedence over the personal emotions that had accompanied the original dispute. That afternoon, I had a video call scheduled with the leadership team of the Developer Attribution Initiative. What had begun as an informal network of like-minded professionals advocating for proper recognition of technical contributions had evolved into a structured nonprofit with corporate partners, educational resources, and policy frameworks being adopted across the industry. The mentorship program is ready to launch, reported Andre, our director of professional development. We've matched 30 senior developers who have successfully navigated attribution issues with junior professionals, seeking guidance on these topics. And the corporate partnership program has 10 companies confirmed for the pilot phase, added Maya, who led our industry relations. These organizations have committed to implementing comprehensive attribution frameworks and sharing their results with our community. The legal resource library is also complete, noted James, our general counsel. Sample contract language, case studies, and negotiation guidance, all accessible to developers needing to address attribution in their employment agreements. As the meeting continued, I marveled at how what had begun as a personal stand for recognition had evolved into a movement with structure, resources, and growing influence. The principles I had articulated through my own experience had resonated with thousands of technical professionals facing similar disconnections between their creative work and their professional identity. After the call, I returned to the final edits of my book's second edition, focusing on a new chapter addressing attribution in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence systems. As technical creation became increasingly collaborative, involving both human developers and AI tools, the questions around attribution grew more complex. Who should be recognized when an algorithm is refined through machine learning? How do we acknowledge the human creativity that shapes AI systems while recognizing the emergent properties of the technology itself? These questions had no simple answers, but the framework I had developed provided a starting point. The principle that creation and credit should maintain their connection, that the human element in technical innovation deserved recognition regardless of the tools involved in the development process. As evening approached, I received a message from David, the former Blue Sky COO, whose decision to terminate me had inadvertently launched this journey. Over the years, our relationship had evolved from adversarial to cautiously collaborative. His consulting practice now regularly advised startups on implementing attribution frameworks from the beginning of their development processes, rather than addressing these issues reactively during growth or acquisition phases. "Thought you might find this interesting," he wrote, attaching an article from a major business publication titled, "The Attribution Revolution in Tech: How Developer Recognition is Reshaping Corporate Culture." The article cited research showing that companies with formal attribution policies were outperforming their peers in technical talent retention, innovation metrics, and even stock performance. What had once been dismissed as a soft cultural issue was increasingly recognized as a hard business advantage. 5 years ago, I would have considered this unnecessary complexity in managing technical teams, David added in his message. Now, I see it as essential infrastructure for sustainable innovation. Your advocacy has shifted the conversation in ways I never anticipated. His acknowledgement wasn't necessary for my sense of validation, but it did highlight how thoroughly the landscape had changed. When executives who had once dismissed attribution as irrelevant became advocates for its business value, the transformation was undeniable. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I received one final message, this one from a name I didn't immediately recognize, Jason Torres. The subject line read simply, "Your framework saved my creation." The message described a situation painfully similar to my experience at Blue Sky, a developer who had built a core component of his company's platform, only to face termination during a management transition. Unlike my case, however, Jason had entered the situation with awareness of attribution principles and clear documentation of his contributions. "When they called me into that conference room, I already knew what was coming," he wrote. "But I also knew exactly what I had created, how it was documented, and what rights I retained. Because of your book and the resources from the Attribution Initiative, I was able to negotiate a transition that respected both the company's legitimate ownership interests and my right to recognition for what I had built." His message ended with a simple statement that encapsulated everything I had hoped to achieve through my advocacy. I didn't have to choose between my creation and my dignity. Thanks to the path you helped clear, I could honor both. As I turned off my light and settled into sleep, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From that Tuesday morning when David had appeared at my desk with termination papers, to this moment of receiving messages from strangers whose professional lives had been positively impacted by the principles I had articulated through my own experience. The landscape of developer attribution continued to evolve, with new challenges emerging as technologies and corporate structures transformed. But the fundamental principle remained constant, that behind every line of code, every algorithm, every digital innovation was a human creator whose connection to their work deserved recognition and respect. Authcore, the authentication service that had sparked this journey, continued to operate seamlessly across multiple platforms, invisibly enabling secure interactions for millions of users who would never know its name or the story of its creation. But in the technical documentation, in the licensing agreements, in the attribution pages of the systems it supported, my name remained, a small but persistent reminder of the human creativity at the heart of technical innovation. That reminder, that acknowledgement of the personal within the corporate, the creative within the commercial, had extended beyond my individual case to touch the work lives of developers across the industry. What I had fought for wasn't just my own recognition, but a principle that all technical creation deserves to maintain its connection to its creators, not just for the benefit of those individuals, but for the integrity of the development process itself. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about all the code I had written over the years, the elegant solutions and the quick fixes, the carefully crafted algorithms and the pragmatic workarounds. Some of that code still ran in systems around the world. Some had been replaced as technology evolved. All of it had carried my distinctive approach to problem solving, my unique way of addressing technical challenges, my code signature, as individual as a fingerprint. The dispute over Authcore had begun as a conflict over ownership and control, but it had ultimately revealed something more fundamental, that technical creation was inherently personal, even within corporate contexts that often treated it as anonymous. That the connection between creator and creation mattered, not as an ego issue, but as a recognition of the human element at the heart of technological innovation. 5 years after that pivotal moment when I had discovered the leverage hidden in my employment contract's appendices, the ripples of that discovery continued to spread through the industry, changing policies, reshaping cultures, influencing how a new generation of developers understood their relationship to what they created. The code I had written would eventually be replaced as technology evolved. The platforms it supported would someday become obsolete. But the principle of connecting creation and credit, of recognizing the human element in technical innovation, could endure, shaping how organizations approached software development for generations to come. That lasting influence, more than any line of code or technical achievement, was perhaps the most meaningful creation of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.